should be able to see it there, shouldn't we? Good evening, everybody from London, and good afternoon if you're in Atlanta. My name is Robert Hush. I'm president of South London Law Society, and I'm very honoured this evening to present and introduce to you a very strong panel of speakers. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter. We're going to be thinking about what it means, and we're going to be thinking about what we might expect to see in the next, say, 6 to 12 months. We have 7 speakers with us this evening. And I'm going to introduce those very briefly so that we can move on and listen to what they want to talk to us about this evening. First of all, Pamela Robotham is a colleague of mine on the committee of South London Law Society. She's a solicitor and she is director of Greenwich Housing Rights. Councillor Mahamed Hashi is the co-founder of the Brixton Soup Kitchen and also co-chair of Stop and Search in the London Borough of Lambeth. Grace Ishola is a second-year law student at London South Bank University. Angela Jackman is a partner at Simpson & Miller Solicitors and also a senior lecturer at the City Law School in London. Imran Khan QC is a solicitor and has represented the family of Stephen Lawrence and played a significant role in the inquiry into the investigation of Stephen's death. Justin Miller is an attorney and a partner at Stuart Miller Simmons Attorneys in Atlanta in the USA. And finally, my friend and colleague Donovan Lindsay is an associate at Anthony Gold Solicitors and is vice president of South London Law Society. And so with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to Donovan, and I'll hand over to you now, Donovan. Thank you very much.
Well, firstly, thank you, Robert, for the introduction. And I'd like to say a warm welcome to all of you who are listening in London, and a good afternoon to people across the pond in America. And special thanks to Justin for taking the time and effort, and we'll expand on his views later on. Sadly, the purpose of today is to discuss what Black Lives Matter means. And since the tragic death of George Floyd in May of this year, there has been a worldwide movement as to what Black Lives Matter means, how it's resonated across continents, and what can and should be done to try and address a number of issues which seems to be an injustice for many decades, and some would say many years, going back from the slave trade, which was over 400 years ago. From my personal view, what Black Lives Matter means is my parents are Windrush generation, and I grew up in Brixton, although it quite changed over the years. And I recall growing up and observing and seeing many incidents, disproportionate victimization against black, especially young black men, the sus laws which have been controversial to say the least, and how things have tried to move on over the coming years. One can look at legislation, and one could argue we're all lawyers teaching and learning the law. Does legislation help? Well, the answer is yes and no. In England, we have the Regulations Act, and that was groundbreaking and quite important. But one could argue that we are still lagging behind on a number of issues. And what is the way that we can maybe address that? Well, the obvious one could be education. And by that, I don't mean education where one is simply at school. We have to look at the broader context, education by friends and family, education through the media. All of these things can help. Living in a diversity environment can also have a positive impact. So we can continue to learn from each other. If we take the panel today, which is very distinguished, if we scratch the surface, we all go back a generation or two to other parts of the world, but we're all here in England, with the exception of Justin, trying to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for the wider community. So these are some of the things that I believe are important and one that we can address over the coming months. But Robert mentioned what will change in the next 6 to 12 months. That's a hard question. One step at a time. I was watching a documentary yesterday on the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the US Supreme Court judge who sadly passed away last week. And what struck me about her was that her movement was about gender equality, but also on other issues. And if you look at the legacy that she has left in America, she's done remarkably well. And in our own country, not too recently, Brenda Hell was the head of the Supreme Court. Again, women who 50 years ago plus were struggling and fighting, and real progress has been made. And I think we can take positives from that, but at the same time, this is going to take quite some time to change. Demonstrations help, media coverage will help, just talking to your neighbour will help. And if we get ourselves into various positions, hopefully that will be positive, but at the same time, we should be mindful that because one could say, well, I've made it because I'm a lawyer, that doesn't cut with other people, because by just being a lawyer by status, it's what you do with that and how you can have an impact on changing not just your client, but also perception on us as a race. So they're the kind of things that I believe can and should happen. I don't have the answers. I don't think everybody has the full answers, but I think by talking and keeping dialogue, that must be one way forward, and let people be argued into our way of thinking. But that's really my pitch for the moment. And on that basis, I would like to move on to Pamela to give her views, please. Pamela? I think you're on mute, Pamela.
Sorry, I'm Pamela. I'm first generation born here. I'm the first person in my family actually born in this country. Raised in South London, spent most of my life in Southwark. I've worked most of my life in this borough. I've been a lawyer since 1989, and I'm really concerned with social welfare issues. That's me. When I was growing up, England was fairly hostile, and over the years, my perception was that things had gotten much better. My family stopped looking over their shoulders, thinking that they may be thrown out of the country, and we began to be more comfortable. I've now settled into middle age, middle class, lawyer, comfortable life. And those are the gains, I think. We've moved from one position of some poverty to another position of some comfort. So this last year or so is catapulting me back to more or less where I started, I think, in some ways. Family members, people from my community have now found themselves to be treated as if they're illegal immigrants. And that's all to do with Windrush. And we've started to think about Black Lives Matter. So when I was asked to speak, first thing I thought was, I don't really like speaking about race because I find it very personal and I find that I'm rather exposed. But I was persuaded that perhaps I should. And also I felt that actually Black Lives Matter at that point was really about Black men, our Black men who were actually fighting for their lives, being killed across the world, a lot of them in institutions over here, in prison, mental health institutions, etc. I felt it had very little to do with me personally, other than as an aunt or a mother. This lady in America last couple of weeks ago has made me realize that actually that's probably not the case, and that there's more of an impact upon me because a woman has lost her life simply because of her color. So I think we've kind of for me, I feel like we've come full circle. So what does it mean for me, Black Lives Matter? I think it means that we've got to reset our clock a bit. We've got to accept that there have been gains, but recognise that there have been plenty losses, in particular in this international climate of intolerance. So my feeling now is what we need to do is not lump everybody together. We need to concentrate, especially in the context of the law, which is what we're talking about today. So my feeling is that I'm really concerned about two sets of people: young Black men. When you look around our profession, young Black African Caribbean men are not as widely represented as African Caribbean women. There's clearly some barriers there that we need to break down, especially if they're not privately educated, etc. The other group that I think we now need to say matter is our Black elderly people, Windrush generation, and the fact that disproportionately it's been African Caribbean men, elderly men actually, that have been impacted by the changes in law, the inability to get legal advice, the sheer weight of the state system falling down on them, in a similar way to how sus was on our young men many years ago. That's where what Black Lives Matters to me. I think we've got to be targeted about how we view this. If we don't, we can lump everybody in one box and help nobody. And I think we should concentrate on our most vulnerable. So what would I like to see? So Donovan's question is, what do I think will change? I suspect if we do not get ourselves together, very little. What I would like to have happen is for us to, as I say, concentrate on specialist and target assisted. So one of the things that's been really nice to see is the South Banks Future Lawyers Project. I see a lot of the young people, I'm taught to them, they're really eager and ambitious. And I think we need to try and help foster the ambition of our young Black people, and in particular our men. I could see a South Bank student here, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying you're not important. If you look at the demographics of the legal profession, African Caribbean men are doing worse than our women. We need to do something about that. And then the second thing, in terms of law, for me, what we can do for our people and to ensure that we recognise that our people matter is to take some action with respect to Windrush generation. It's nothing short of a disgrace that people that can have come to this country and given their whole of their working lives to this country, often abandoning their own country and helping their own countries develop, they reach pensionable age and be basically sent back to where they've come from. That to me is unacceptable. And so what I'd like us to do really is sort of use our legal knowledge and our legal skills to ensure that we protect that group of people as well. That's not to say, I'm not one of these all live, that's not to say that everybody else doesn't matter, but if we're going to target our assistance, I think that's where I would like it to. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Pamela. That was really useful and insightful. I'd like to pick up on a few things. You mentioned about gains and losses and how we need to target and concentrate on specific. Can you expand to the panel and to the wider audience? When you say target, can you tell us what you mean by that, please?
Well, if I just say a little bit about the game. I'm born here, but I've never felt like I belonged here. I'm in my 50s and I finally, in the last 7 years or so, feel that this is my place. This Windrush stuff has actually catapulted me back to where I started in terms of where I belong in. In terms of targeting, we are lawyers and we've got the law as a tool for us to use to help people. And we as lawyers and people who are in the profession can use that to assist young people in coming through to become lawyers. So we can have them come in at our workplaces, give them access to the things that they don't have access to, which makes them write very poor applications and can't get into the profession. So that's what I mean in terms of targeting, being sure that we know, for me anyway, where I think my help is best used. And also for our elderly people, it's participating in schemes where I'm involved in a scheme which is going to be a student-led project, helping Caribbean people claim compensation for the Windrush injustices. And that's where, so for me, that's where I'm targeting my help, assistance. I think some people need more help than others.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. And you talk about Windrush generation, which, from a West Indian point of view, they were the pioneers. And quite an interesting quick story. When my parents were still alive, my mother sadly passed away now. This was back in the mid-70s. My mother said to my father, "We need to apply for a British passport." And my father was saying, "Well, you know, I'm Jamaican, I don't need one." She said, "No, we have the children. They're born here. We need to apply." So my mother went ahead and changed citizenship. And sadly, what happened last year, my father said, "Was a good job I listened to your mother, because maybe he would have had a Jamaican passport and he may have had problems himself." So that's a lesson and something that needs to be still pushed and touched on. And I know that the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy's worked tirelessly on that, and hopefully something positive will come from that. Well, thank you very much, Pamela. I'd like to go now to Councillor Mahamed Hashi, please, if you're able to give your view. Thank you.
Evening. I'll tell you what, the topic was very interesting for me, and it's one similar to Pamela. I struggle with expressing externally because I'm still trying to get my head around it internally. So just a bit about myself. I'm a director of 2 companies in London, one a youth organisation. So I've been a youth worker for the last 20 years now, despite my youthful look. I also run an award-winning soup kitchen. You know, we've won so many awards, so much recognition just for giving food and you know, companionship to the most needy in our communities. We've won awards with the Evening Standard, been named top 1,000 influential Londoners 3 years in a row, been awarded an honorary doctorate by another university, so I won't name it. And in 2018, I was actually elected as the first Somali councillor in Lambeth ever, which is a borough in London, which for me was really a point of celebration initially, until I really thought back and thought, actually, Somali people have been in this country since the 1940s. And to have the first Somali councillor in a borough like Lambeth, which has places like Brixton and Streatham in it, is a bit disappointing, really. So I've gone to university 3 times. My first degree was in biomedical science. I've then studied my PGC to become a qualified science teacher. I've done a master's in forensic science and I got my honorary PhD. However, despite the fact that I've never been in a gang, never sold drugs, never done anything illegal that I've been caught for, I was still the victim at the age of 15. I was still the victim of a stabbing in an attempted robbery in 1999. And in 2008, I was actually a victim of a shooting while breaking up a fight. Now, for me, what was really interesting about these experiences was how I felt the world, especially as a young black man, I felt the entire world turned against me. And it turned against me from the point of being a victim, which was really, really weird for me. I remember I felt vilified by the newspapers who turned around and said I had an argument with a group of 16-year-olds in a chicken shop. You know, at the time I was supposed to be on a diet, so that really got me in my heart because it insinuated I was buying chicken. The police, I felt vilified by the police because they came to me and were immediately like, "Oh, we know you know who done it. We know you've got information, and we know you was involved at X, Y, and Z." And I thought, you know, it just reinforced how I felt about the police at the time. I was only 23. And for me, the most disappointing was the vilification I got from my own community. You know, parents of kids that I was working with who wrote into the head teacher and said, why have you employed a gang member? We heard he got shot in a drug deal gone wrong. All these kind of stories started getting made up. And for me, that was heartbreaking, because I always kind of grew up with this kind of attitude of, thankfully I always grew up in the area of Brixton, which always had that diversity. So I grew up used to seeing, West Africans and Caribbean people and East Africans, and we're all together in harmony. So that kind of reaction to me really threw me off. Now, I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress 5 years after the actual incident, which really made me understand, because that was me with a solid support network, good history, good connections, and I had a good reputation as well. So there was a lot of support there for me, but it still took 5 years for me to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And for me, what's funny is I've been stopped over 60 times by the police, most recently last year, sitting in my car and having police officers. This is despite the fact that I currently sit on 5 advisory groups at Scotland Yard. I was the chair of the Stop and Search Monitor Group in Lambeth for 7 years. I was the chair of the Pan London Stop and Search Monitor Group at City Hall for 3 years. And police still came up to me, asked me to wind down my window. I asked them what they wanted. They said to me, we're stopping you for drugs. Yeah, Section 23, misuse of drugs. And I said to them, what's the grounds? And they said to me, and I know this is going to shock every law student here or graduate. They said to me, it's because I look young and my car looks expensive. It has led them to believe that I am a drug dealer. And that was recorded on their own camera within the constituency that I was elected to become a councillor in. And that just reminded me, again, similar to something Pam said again, it just took me all the way back to the beginning. Because I was like, firstly, that's illegal. And I went through pace with them, but they didn't really have an understanding or an appetite to understand. So for me, one of the things I want to say is, what's worse than being black? It's being black and young. By the grace of God, I've been told often that I have a youthful look, which I haven't been able to celebrate yet because I keep getting stopped so often. But for me, it's the environment that I'm in. I live in Lambeth. We've got the highest rates of youth violence, highest incidence of mental health, second highest rates of teen pregnancy, highest rates of HIV. 1 in 3 children is born into poverty. Black residents are 4 times more likely to be unemployed. If you're a black boy, you're 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched, 3 times more likely to be arrested, and more likely to receive a custodial sentence for the same crime. And for me, then when we flip it, you're also, as a young black man, you're also more likely to be the perpetrator and the victim of violent crime here. And that really confused me, because it feels like our young people are being attacked from every angle. So going back to the main question, what does Black Lives Matter to me? For me, I'm less about the movement and more about the actual wording, right? And for me, it feels like to me, and this is, despite what's happened, all the things that's happened this year, I feel like I have been given hope. Because I have felt like black people care about each other again. I feel like we all come together and shared our experiences and shared our knowledge and stood up for each other. And I haven't seen that for such a long time. So for me, Black Lives Matter means we cannot and will not stay quiet no more. But it also means we have to love ourselves and each other more. And when I say ourselves, I mean ourselves as individuals. We have to love ourselves, because I feel like we haven't loved ourselves for a long time. We've just kind of gotten with it. We've just moved forward. I also love each other, because a lot of the time I feel like people get into positions where they become the only kind of black face in the room, and they close the door because they want to keep that feeling of feeling special. They want to keep that feeling. And what a lot of people don't realize is that that means you're secluded and you're isolated. So when it comes to things like voting for a chair of a group or voting for motions to be put through and change regulations, you're the only voice who has the experience from that aspect. And I think the biggest thing that I've come away with from this Black Lives Matter is we have to get rid of terms like BME. That's just my personal opinion. I don't like it. Because what it does, it insinuates that every black experience is the same experience. And not just that, because as an East African man, I have a different experience from a West African man, different experience from a Caribbean man, different experience from an Egyptian man, different experience from all these different black people from all over the world, let alone other minorities. So for me, if we do that, what it does for me is it erodes the actual strength of our experiences. And I'm not for that. So when Black Lives Matter came out and you had that rhetoric, all lives matter, it actually reminded me of BME. All ethnic minorities matter. All ethnic minorities are not 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched, or 3 times more likely to be arrested, or more likely to receive a custodial sentence than their white counterpart. So it's totally different. So for me, what we have to do, I think we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect each other. We have to stand up for what we believe in, even if it means that we have to speak out and put ourselves on the line. Because for me, we're fighting for more than just us. We're fighting for our entire futures. We can see the state our young people are in. And that's because we have concentrated so long on surviving that we have forgot to thrive. And thriving means that we teach our young people how to grow safely and not grow under pressure. I feel like we have to educate ourselves more, especially around things like the law. And it just doesn't stop at education. I feel like we have to get involved locally. When I became a councillor, I had voted twice. And one of them was for myself. So I think technically I voted once. Because I didn't care. I was too busy dealing with violence and fear and everything else that comes and distracts us from the overall plan. I didn't realise that how local politics was working, let alone national politics and international politics. But again, in terms of how we shape things, how can we shape things if we're not sitting at the tables that are actually coming up with the policies? We're only there asking people to push things through once they have already been formulated. I feel like there's an education about the system and the mechanism of the system that has to be shared. And I think that starts at school, where they're not teaching our kids what they should be teaching them. They're teaching them how to be workers and respond to orders, as opposed to using the brilliance that they have. I think we need to start using more of our local resources, which Black Lives Matter has shown me. We have to empower our local communities, which Black Lives Matter has shown me. You know, for me, these were all tests. And just on a final one, because I know I've probably gone over time. It's a statement that I say to everyone, is that we shouldn't just see the trauma the communities have gone through, but we should also look at the resilience we've had to build in order to survive what we've gone through. We are amazing. And it's time the world knows that. Thank you. I feel like that was a speech, sorry.
No, thank you, Mohammed. That was very well put, and quite an interesting life you've had, and becoming a councillor for the last few years and still being stopped over 60 times this year. It must be quite horrific. And I can't say I know how you feel, because I don't. But one thing you mentioned about near the end, you know, we need to grow, we need to educate. And I think you're never too old to learn, and we should always try to listen to not just our elders, but the youngsters coming up, because they are the future and they can give us some examples. And it's interesting that the next person happens to be Grace, who is the younger member of the panel, who is in her second year of university, and maybe she can give some insight into her knowledge, but also when you mentioned about growing and educating. So without further ado, can I please seek the assistance of Grace to give us her views on these matters, please? Grace?
Hi, so I'm a second year law student, and social justice is really important to me. That's actually one of the reasons, well, actually the main reason why I wanted to study law. Growing up in care, I felt like a lot of things happened that shouldn't have happened. There was a lot of unconscious bias. There was a lot of dehumanizing young children, young Black children. I think that's a very apparent issue. And I really wanted to understand how the systems kind of worked. I wanted to understand what actions were justified and what wasn't. So that's why I went on to study law. So what Black Lives Matter means for me is that, first of all, the notion that all lives matter, there shouldn't be such an emphasis. There shouldn't be so much attention focused on a slogan. The attention should be on the issues that kind of was why that slogan was pushed in the first place. I feel like there's a lot of gaslighting, there's a lot of distraction tactics being used, and I feel like there's so much that needs to be drawn upon, and there's so much things that we need to break down and really get to the bottom of and find solutions from, as opposed to focusing on which slogan we should stick on this. So definitely think one thing that the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of highlighted for me is how much people want to focus on the kind of the things that don't really matter, as opposed to dealing with the issues at hand. Yes, there has been a divide. The divide is very apparent, and I think that's because I've spoken to a lot of people, and I know I even have some friends who feel uncomfortable being even coming to terms with some of the things that they're finding out. A lot of people, there's so much new information circulating on the internet, which is most probably already there, but a lot of it's quite a shock to the system, finding out things about your history, things like how people in the UK are still being paid reparations for having to return slaves, things like that. It's really a shock to the system, and it just goes to show that it just makes you feel like you're not really supposed to be here. So definitely this time has, especially when the Black Lives Matter movement began, it was very much isolating, and definitely made me and some other people my age feel like they didn't really belong here. But I think in terms of that, having a really strong support network and having friends who, not even non-Black friends, who really go out of their way to understand the issues faced by the Black community and really campaign for these issues and campaign for change, that's really important as well. So I don't agree that there should be a divide. I think it's more about finding a way to discuss these issues, making it a really safe place to discuss these issues. Also not placing so much pressure on a lot of young people to understand or be able to explain these issues, such as microaggressions, because it is a lot of pressure. I mean, everyone has access to resources, everyone can go out of their way to really learn about it, the same way that I'm sure a lot of Black people are going out of their way to kind of learn about their history, learn about these issues, and learn about how to deal with these issues when they're kind of faced with them. I know growing up, I faced a lot of microaggressions that I didn't quite understand were microaggressions, but this new information circulating really helped me define and understand why I felt so uncomfortable in the past. So I definitely agree with Pamela when she noted that Black men do have it really difficult. I don't disagree in the slightest. I mean, there's also the issue that men are faced with, that they're not allowed to cry, they're not allowed to be sensitive, things like that. So that, on top of being Black, and knife crime issues being stopped and searched. So I do completely agree, and I also think that a lot of Black children are dehumanized as well. There's big books written about it. So they're treated like they're supposed to be know and think better, even if they're very young. What I think needs to change going forward, which is where I agree with Mohammed, is that the law needs to be kind of mandatory. So from high school, from primary school, if you can, to really start teaching children the basics of the criminal system, what's justified, what isn't, how to deal with situations, soft skills like how to deal with situations like microaggressions, what microaggressions are, and dealing with self-hate issues. So this can be done by having books where it has Black children as well, dolls of Black children, really get to the root of self-hate issues from the get-go. And also having training with people that have any contact with children, Black children, training on racial bias, unconscious bias, things like that. These things will really have an impact. People sometimes don't even realize that they have an unconscious bias, and it needs to be kind of taken down, and it needs to happen. This training needs to be implemented with foster carers, teachers, social workers, because I know I've even had interactions with my social worker, and there was a very clear unconscious bias. So yeah, I think that's what needs to change going forward.
Thank you very much, Grace. That's very interesting. I'd like to pick up on a few points, if I may. You mentioned unconscious bias, and obviously that's a big issue that has been discussed over the past few months, more so than ever. And the fact of it being unconscious, people may argue we're not sure we're doing this. What can you give an example to the panel of something you've experienced unconsciously?
Oh goodness. Gosh. I know an example was when I was growing up in a care home with some other kids. One of the staff members said to me, "I'd just eaten and I was bloated. I'm quite skinny in frame," and she compared me to one of the black children on the adverts in Africa, and I think things like that, kind of referring to someone about something that that's kind of predominantly affects where they kind of come from.
Okay, thank you. And one final thing, I mean, obviously we're trying to make this panel as wide as possible. You're young starting out. What do young people think about what's happening over the past year since the tragic death of Lloyd George? What are you lot talking about? What do you think can change? One of the questions is, where do you think we can be in the next 6, 12 months? Do you think there's one specific thing that could be done to assist?
I think there's a lot of mixture of opinions. I know when it first started, I had friends that were very frustrated, friends that were disappointed, friends that were, I would go as far as to say depressed, felt really isolated, alone. Some friends that felt kind of helpless, they didn't know what to do. Some friends very much knew that this is what needs to be done, but it's not being done. I know I had friends with differing opinions as to whether it was a good idea to kind of riot or whether it was more issues that need to be done with the system. I think there's a lot of mixture of opinions, and I think from what I said before as well, a lot of unconscious bias training. So understanding that, saying things like, for example, if you have an Asian person and they're very smart, you don't say things like, "Oh, your parents must be so proud of you," or assuming an Asian person is very intelligent, things like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Grace. That's very helpful. And I'd like to move on now to one of the other members or guests, Angela Jackman, please. Angela.
Hello, everybody. So similar to Donovan and Pamela, my parents were also Windrush generation. So my experience of racism has been very much influenced by that. And I would say that the racism that my parents experienced was perhaps much more blatant to some extent than the racism that many of us experience today. And what I'm acutely aware of was the really limited opportunities that the Windrush generation had, and just the huge sacrifices that they made for us, uprooting, leaving their loved ones, and sometimes having to leave children back at home to come to the motherland to make a better life on invitation from this country. I was very much active in terms of race politics since being at school, and perhaps the more mature members of the panel might remember, for example, the Rock Against Racism movements and the Anti-Nazi League. So I do remember organising at quite a young age with other school friends around really trying to challenge racism and the National Front, which was the main threat at the time. And since I've been at university, I've been very much committed to working with BAME, and I know that's a controversial term, so people of colour organisations, to activate for change and to try and really improve inclusion and racial equality. I've also got 2 daughters, teenagers, and it's been really interesting seeing how they've become politicised to some extent over the last few years, and how Black Lives Matter has really affected them, as I think has been the case for many young people in particular. So what does it mean to me, Black Lives Matter? Well, I share the comments made by Grace that it was an incredibly overwhelming, difficult time during summer, because at work, at home, social media, talking to family, everyone was really directly affected by the terrible, terrible events around George Floyd. And there was just a complete outpouring of many experiences that maybe some of us had suppressed, or we were learning for the first time and really sharing and supporting. But at times it was incredibly difficult. And the whole focus on race has been crucial, but it's been, I think, at some personal cost to many of us. It's also highlighted, I think, that there simply hasn't been enough change. I think that goes without saying. And, you know, colleagues on this panel and colleagues who will follow me, I'm sure, will be saying the same thing. It's been a real focus point that much more needs to be done, and we can't sit back and be complacent. Having said that, I think that it's really shone the spotlight on race, and I think what was really striking over the summer was how so many resources and materials from Black activists and writers became mainstream. So we had everyone reading, for example, many people reading Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. We had Aqua Hirsch, we had Bernardine Evaristo, and that's, I think, been very positive for the people of colour community and also for white colleagues. And I think one of the features of this is the fact that there are white colleagues who are really thinking about race and who want to act as allies for us. And I think it's the first time that I've really felt that as a strong force. And I think it's very important for that to continue. But at the same time, for our allies to respect that we have our agenda. If we, for example, want to form people of colour only spaces, and that should be accepted and not challenged and not understood. And the issues around white fragility have really got to be understood by our peers to support us so that we can move forward and deal with all of these issues. I think what was also really key was how many organisations put out public statements. They were popping up all over on social media, which on the one hand was great, but on the other hand, it's not just about lip service. So organisations and employers who put out statements have absolutely got an obligation to see through those statements and to put in effect policies and practices so that those statements have meaning. The time has come and gone for lip service being paid to race, equality and inclusion. So some of the positive changes that have given me some hope, Mohammed talked about feeling hope. So some institutions have been quite quick dealing with the immediate demands. So there have been, for example, some name changes. Some institutions have brought down statues which celebrated, as we know, slave ownership and the slave trade. And what do I want over the next 6 months? Because I think we've made a start, but there's still much more to happen. I want organisations to be listening to people of colour, whether they're within the organisation or outside, and really thinking about having long-lasting change. It isn't enough to simply act in the moment, to respond to the huge amount of worldwide publicity that Black Lives Matter have obtained over the last few months, to put it in a box, deal with it and think, oh, fine. This is going to be long-term because racism is endemic. And I think that recognition of institutional racism has perhaps improved to some degree, but we have so much more to do. So I practice as a lawyer, and I'm also a senior lecturer at City Law School. I practice at Simpson Miller. So I just had a few thoughts really about Black Lives Matter in those different categories or hats that I wear. And I'm really concerned about the fact that the legal profession remains unrepresentative of people of colour. I had a look earlier this afternoon at some stats. And so the Solicitors Regulation Authority on their website are saying as recently as March that Black and Asian lawyers remain significantly unrepresented in mid to large size firms. Less the case for sole practitioners, and we've known that many people of colour have had the challenges of operating as sole practitioners or small groups. But in terms of breaking into the larger firms, that's not happening, and that needs to change. And, you know, firms, institutions really need to overhaul and have a long, hard look at why those stats are not changing. This afternoon, I was browsing social media, as you do, and there was a Guardian article, some of you may have seen it today, a young barrister just starting out on her career, stopped 3 times in one day in a criminal court because of an assumption that she was a defendant. I responded, pointing out that this has been going on since the 80s, if not before, and nothing's changing. I'm pleased to hear that there's going to be an investigation undertaken, but, you know, I think we'll all be looking really long and hard to see, is this going to result in long-term change so that when a black person walks into a court, there isn't an assumption that you must be the defendant. It's absolutely outrageous and unacceptable. Similarly, I note that in terms of the judiciary, we know that there are issues in terms of diversity, but I noticed that there have been recent reports indicating that BAME applicants are overrepresented in terms of applications, but are less likely to be successful. When is that going to change? So I think there needs to be real hard scrutiny, perhaps external inputs into organisations to make this change. In terms of access to young people qualifying as barristers, there are still also issues there. Having said that, I am also aware that some colleagues are trying to take steps to overcome that. So I've seen, for example, this week that there are some barristers' chambers who are actively putting in place mentoring schemes for our up-and-coming young barristers such as Grace and your peers, and I'm hopeful that that will make some difference. Quickly turning to some thoughts around what Black Lives Matter mean in terms of academia, I remain very concerned about the attainment gap and the fact that just last year, Universities UK and the NUS reported that there's a 13% attainment gap between the likelihood of white students and students from BAME backgrounds being awarded a first and 2-1. And that obviously directly impacts on the prospects and employability of our young people coming through seeking to qualify and establish themselves in the profession. In terms of positive things, and I have had some positive kind of experiences, I'm really encouraged by the way that Black Lives Matter has invigorated the next generation that's coming through. And I'll give an example. I work with young people because one of my areas of practice is education law. And I'm really struck, for example, how I've had a number of calls whereby young people are themselves saying, we're not prepared to accept, for example, discriminatory practices at school. And even if it means that we have a battle whilst we're still at school, we want to take steps to bring about change. And just by way of an example, many of you may know that each September there's normally something in the press, for example, about schools bringing in yet more draconian policies around BAME students being able to wear their hair in its natural state, which still continues to baffle me, but it's still an ongoing issue. So in a nutshell, I feel that Black Lives Matter has brought about a real sea change, and I think that it's been overdue for us to have this real focus on race, equality, and challenging those institutions that have kept us out or kept us suppressed. And I feel that there's no going back. And I feel that the unity, I think Mohammed referred to this, the unity that has sprung up as a result of Black Lives Matter is a force to be reckoned with. And I feel to some extent really encouraged and positive about future change. So those are the main thoughts that I had in terms of what does Black Lives Matter mean for me and what do I hope will happen within the next 6 months, which is for some of those changes to be put in place and to be built on further by institutions and employers and society as a whole.
Thank you, Angela. Very strong, deep comments, and quite a lot there. Unity is something you touched upon, as did Mohammed, and the communities coming together as one. And I think that is one of the keys to this. We have to stick together very strongly and see how matters progress over the months and also over the years. There is a long way to go, as you rightly pointed out, and one can only hope that with what's happened and the public awareness, things will continue to move in a positive way, not just in society, but also within the profession as well. But thank you very much for that. And I'd like to move on now to our guest from across the pond, Justin, who I understand you've had a very busy day and the day is still very young for you. So I'd like you, Justin, if you could kindly come up to the mic and give us your views and thoughts on the issues that we're discussing, please.
Sure. Thank you guys for having me. First and foremost, I'm learning a lot of things today that I didn't know about. I just being on this call, I have Googled Windrush, and I didn't know anything about it. And the thing to me that is really telling about what we're doing right now is that, you know, people here on this side of the pond don't know a lot about the struggle that you guys are going through. And it's really sad that we are this far away from each other and we are all going through the same things. I mean, it kind of breaks my heart because, you know, there are struggles, but I feel like these struggles are probably, if we were to talk to some people in, Australia, Black people in Australia or Black people in other parts of the world, they will be going through their own struggles too. And that's pretty sad if you ask me. It is heartening though, and I do feel some comfort that, you know, we are all a family, and regardless of if we are dealing with, you know, the things you guys are dealing with or what we're dealing with over here, we're dealing with it together. And I've heard a lot of people today on this panel say that same thing. We're dealing with it together. I think that it would help a lot if we had a little bit more solidarity between Black people around the world, because I think as a group, we are very, very strong, and we have a loud voice. And so going forward, I know that I'm going to reach out and try to see what I can do to help bridge that gap, because, you know, I know for a fact that many Black people here just don't understand what you guys are going through. I know some of it because of schooling and because of the work I do with BBC. But some of it I just don't know. And so I'm glad that you guys are here and are able to educate me, you know, as I try to give you some insight as to what we're going through over here. That's the first thing. Just for a little background, I am from Atlanta, Georgia. And geographically, that is in the deepest part of the deep South of the United States. I grew up in an area where the Ku Klux Klan originated. And when I was younger, my brothers and I would go into the woods and walk, you know, as far as we could walk, just being kids and going into the woods and seeing what we could see when we would explore. And, you know, a couple times we ran up on Klan rallies. We would see them, you know, planting, you know, crosses in the ground and drinking beers and getting ready to do whatever kind of diabolical Klan stuff they do, you know. And so we would run off and hide, and we didn't think much of it. And now as an adult thinking back on it, that is extremely sad to me that was okay. And I know it's going on now in some parts of America, and you know, there has to be a change because that is unacceptable. I graduated from Morehouse College, which is an all-Black male institution in Atlanta, if you don't know. And so there, I kind of learned a lot of things that you don't really get at predominantly white schools in America. And it kind of shaped what I wanted to do with my life going forward. And after Morehouse, I went to St. John's University, which is in New York, for law school. And I thought when I started law school that I wanted to be a Wall Street lawyer, securities lawyer. And I worked on Wall Street for a little while, and I realized that was not what I wanted to do. And that was a waste of my talents and time. And I came back to Atlanta to try to help my people here. And I did that in many ways. In the beginning, I was a criminal lawyer. I defended people, and I was a civil lawyer, and I've been doing civil work the entire time, but I was a criminal lawyer as well. So I've seen both sides of the coin as it relates to Black people being persecuted and given the short end of the stick as it relates to government interactions. So about, I would say 10 years ago, I really kind of thought about what I wanted to do, and I just started focusing on civil law. And I don't do just civil rights. I do a lot of injury law and things of that nature. But the civil rights cases kind of come to you if you're a member of the community and you know people in the community. So that has been my experience. And for the last, I would say, 5 years, I've kind of taken on more civil rights cases. And then this year, I joined one of my good friends in a firm, and we have some of the biggest civil rights cases in the world right now. We represent some of the families of people that you've heard of, I'm sure. So we represent the daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd. And, you know, of course, that was kind of the catalyst for a lot of the stuff that's going on right now. So from day one on that case, I was in Minnesota on the ground, talking to people, taking the temperature of the community, kind of seeing what was really going on there, because, you know, Minnesota to Georgia might as well be England to America. Same thing. That distance, that kind of cultural shift, I had never been there and really experienced it. And so that was eye-opening for me. And so we're pushing that case right now and working on that. I represent the mother of Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed in Brunswick, Georgia, which is the southernmost part of Georgia, by some guys in a pickup truck while he was jogging down the street, shot in the chest with a shotgun. And we represent his mother and trying to get justice for her. We represent the family of Rayshard Brooks, who was killed by the police, shortly after George Floyd in Atlanta at a Wendy's. As he was asleep in his car, he had been drinking. He fell asleep in the drive-thru at Wendy's. He had an altercation with the police, and while he was fleeing, he was shot in the back. And so we represent his family as well. My firm also represents Alton Sterling. I don't know if you remember that case, but it was in Louisiana. And Alton Sterling was killed by the cops. He was unarmed. And we're trying to, right now, we're in the process of negotiating with them, hopefully a civil settlement, because the criminal case was handled a couple years ago. And then my partner, he handled the Walter Scott case that was in South Carolina, where the Walter Scott was shot in the back by a police officer who lied and said that he had a gun on him, and he didn't. So we have a lot of these cases, and we are dealing with a lot of these cases. Some of the people who are representing other families in these cases, like the Breonna Taylor case, Ben Crump, he is co-counsel on a couple of these cases, and Lee Merritt, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's been doing a lot of good work in this field. He is co-counsel on some of these cases. But there's a small group of us who are kind of pushing on these cases. And, we need you guys' help as well. I know you have, and I'm hearing it, your own issues and your own stuff to deal with, but we need your help. And I'm sure you could use our help with y'all stuff too. And so inroads probably need to be made after this so that we can all help each other move forward. So to the question of Black Lives Matter and what does that mean to me, I was listening to everyone talk about what it means to them. And I kind of had those exact same thoughts that most of you had. And I just had a few other things I wanted to share. The Black Lives Matter movement, I think that it is showing us that we can't live in our own world. We can't just, go in a house and have a big house and drive nice cars and have, great jobs and wear nice suits. We have to help the rest of our people. the rest of the Black people. And that's just not in our cities, in our states, in our countries, but in the rest of the world. And some of you have discussed this, and that is very important. And so I have seen that across the country, there are different levels of, I would say, some people call it wokeness or alertness to what is going on and how this is affecting our community as a whole. And so for us, for the people on this call, for the people who do know and we do get it, we have to help and push these things to those who just won't know. And they're ready for it and they want it, but we have to actively give it to them. And one thing that I've been telling a lot of my friends who are lawyers here, and even, you know, some people who aren't lawyers, who are professionals or people who have large social media followings, is that you have to use your platform for things other than money. And this is the time for it, because we haven't had a time like this since, you know, in America, at least since the 60s, when we had the first civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and those guys. And I feel like this is kind of similar. And we have more access to people because of social media. So in the 60s, we couldn't do what we're doing right now. I wouldn't get to see you guys and hear your stories, and you wouldn't get to hear mine. And so now that we have these platforms, we have to use them. And if we don't use them in the proper way, I think we're doing the movement a disservice, and we're doing our people as a whole a disservice. The second thing I would say is the world is now seeing that, and this is because of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think the world is seeing that Black people, we deal in trauma. I mean, generally, our lives are filled with trauma. It is about, for us, overcoming trauma. We make music and songs about the trauma that we've dealt with in our lives. You know, some of the best artists, you know, whether it be, you know, R&B artists, soul artists, rap artists, they're talking about trauma that we go through every day. We sell this to the world, you know, as entertainment. And I think that, you know, the world is ready to buy our trauma every day, but they aren't ready to help us get over it. And I think that this movement has shown that, you know, there are people who love our music and love our culture, but don't love us as a people. And so I think that to really get to the bottom of this and to fix a lot of this, we're going to have to get the world to understand that they need to love us for who we are as a people, and not just love the trauma that we can give to them. It's really a sick kind of voyeuristic type thing. You know, they like to hear about, you know, what happens to us in the hood, and, you know, what happens in our homes and when our doors close, and what happens to us when we have to fight the police and fight back and, you know, fight the government. But they don't want to, you know, kind of empathize with us as people. And that's really what it is. We're just all people, but they don't want to empathize with us, but they will buy our trauma. So that's one thing I've seen. The other thing Black Lives Matter has shown me, and it means to me, is that we can dismantle systemic racism in this country. That is, and in your country and in the world, we can dismantle it. We just have to really, you know, kind of measure our steps and then do it. And we have the mental capacity to do it. We have people smart enough. We have the boots on the ground, which is, you know, evident by all of the protests. And you see the people, and I call them young people. Some people call me young people, you know, and everybody's young to someone, right? But there are people outside on the ground right now with the energy to do whatever we need to do to make these things happen. We just have to kind of guide them. I was doing an interview a few months ago, and they were asking me about how I felt about riots and protests. And I was telling them I don't really condone any kind of violence or, you know, destruction of property. But that's not my main concern. My main concern is the energy. And the energy is there. We just have to guide the energy in the direction that it needs to go. And if we can guide that energy in a good direction, then we can, you know, have some real change. And that goes for you guys over there and us here. The energy is there. And that's what this movement is. It's just energy, raw energy. And we, the ones with the training and the knowledge and the know-how, we have to guide it. So I think that's one thing that this movement has shown me. Another thing is, and I don't ever want to forget this. My job and our job is getting justice for these families and for people who are victims of systemic racism and victims of, violence by their government and police. Our job is to get people justice. And sometimes I think that we go so far past that we forget that that's why we're here and that's where we started from. And so I like to kind of, center myself and ground myself a lot and just think about George Floyd's daughter, because George Floyd's daughter she will benefit from whatever we can come up with as lawyers and as thinkers, but she will also benefit specifically by me getting justice for her father in civilly and trying to help with getting justice for him criminally. So, we have to be grounded and stay grounded and not really separate ourselves from the people who need us the most. We have to take advantage of this time in history. We can't be silent anymore. And a lot of people touched on this. We have to make it socially and financially difficult for people to be racist and prejudiced. As you know, this country has a sordid history with racism and prejudice. And it's just one of these things where you don't talk about it. And as I've listened to a lot of you, it sounds like it's the same there, where you just don't talk about it, and it happens, and you move forward and you try to do your best in your life, but you don't talk about it and you move forward, and we can't do that anymore. I am not going to sit silent anymore. And I'm not allowing people around me to sit silent. There were times where, some of my white colleagues would make a joke or, say something that was inappropriate, and I wouldn't say anything. And a few years ago, I stopped doing that. But now, all bets are off. It is tongue lashing season when it comes to racism and prejudice around me. We can't let people make racist and prejudiced decisions as it relates to hiring, because these things affect, more than just if we get a job or not. It affects, if you're talking about, I don't know what they call it in the UK, but here, district attorneys or attorneys general, like Daniel Cameron, who was the attorney general who decided not to charge the cops who killed Breonna Taylor with any kind of crime relating to her death. This guy, he was there because he was appointed, because someone didn't vote, and he hired people to work under him who were doing the investigations. And these things are all very important. And I think we kind of overlook them sometimes when we're talking about the importance of voting and hiring and how it affects us on a day-to-day basis. Because I've never wanted to be a prosecutor, but I always wanted prosecutors that were good and that would look at people who look like me, give them the benefit of the doubt like they give other people. And so that is something that we have to stay on top of, even if we're not prosecutors. What I'm seeing, and I'm pretty sure it's probably the same. The young lady, is it Grace Ishola? She was talking about her experiences, and I have 2 children. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I have been struggling her entire life to make sure that she has good role models for her to see, that look like her, and it's difficult. We'll go to the store, and if you don't want to buy a doll, there will be 100 dolls that do not look like her and 2 that do. And so the choices are slim, and I need, that to end. I need there to be more representation for the kids. And that's a part of Black Lives Matter. There needs to be more representation in movies and television and in toys and in music, representation that someone can see and say, hey, I can be that. And I want to be like that. A quick story. When the George Floyd stuff happened, I went to Minnesota, and Joe Biden wanted to meet with the family of George Floyd, to kind of give his condolences, and I'm sure it was for a photo op as well. But when he got there, we all got a chance to talk to him and sit down with him, And I remember, I am 6'5", I weigh 240 pounds. I'm a big person. When I got there, I shook his hand, and the first thing he said was, "You must have played ball somewhere. Where do you play ball?" And I was just, flabbergasted. I was like, well, why are we talking about basketball? I'm here to talk about the death of George Floyd and how this affected his daughter. And he's talking to me about basketball. And I just sat there and thought about it. And I said, in his mind, he doesn't see anything wrong with that. I know he's just trying to kind of make conversation and build some kind of rapport. But he didn't even understand, how prejudiced that is, how racist that is, and how that could affect me. And then I thought about all the times that happens to me when I go on an airplane. And if I because I'm so tall, I have to sit in first class, not that I don't like first class, but, that's the place where I can get some leg room. And when I sit there, I would say 9 out of 10 times, someone white asks me, who do you play for? What do you play a sport? And I tell them, no, I'm a lawyer. And then they look at me like I'm crazy. And then I just put my headphones on and turn away. But that kind of thing has to stop. And that's when, to me, that's when I will know that change has occurred. When those type of things stop happening, I will know that real change has occurred. I mean, I'm sure that those are not the most pressing issues, but those are really symptoms of a bigger problem. And the last thing that I'll share is this, and this is a kind of a positive thing. And I like to end on a positive note. My children, I have a son that's 10 and a daughter that's 7, like I told you. And my children, the first president they've ever known, the only president that they knew before Donald Trump in this country was Barack Obama. And so I remember that my son asked me, he said to me one day, he said, listen, I didn't know that, white people, were president too. And this is, maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And I started laughing. I was just like, yeah, white people could be the president too. And I thought that was a good thing, because my grandmother, who died when she was 90 years old in 2001, she told me we would never, ever in this country have a black president ever. And to have children that didn't know anything other than a black president, because, when they were born and the president for those 8 years was a black man, was just an amazing thing. And I was happy to that narrative was changed for my children. And so I appreciate the time. Thank you guys for having me. And, hopefully we can work together to come up with some resolution for your country, my country, and for the world at large.
Justin, that was fantastic. You have a beautiful backstory with so much history and warmth and love. And clearly you're right. You must use your platform, and we, UK and America, must pull together and work with each other. You mentioned where you were born, and you were pulled back there from the bright lights of New York. You realised that the pull was too great, and your people wanted you. And it's quite refreshing to hear the stories that you've raised. And we will have time for some questions, which have been filtered through from Robert. And there's quite a number of interesting topics that we can push on from. But thank you again so much for taking the time to talk to us. And last but not least, we have Imran Khan QC, who I last met Imran July last year. We both gave a speech at the Law Society Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And now we're back together on a slightly similar subject, but more serious. Anyway, without further ado, Imran, could you kindly give us your thoughts on the issues for today, please?
Yes, thank you. Black lives matter because black people have been subjected to centuries of slavery, decades of second-class citizenship, widespread legalized discrimination, economic persecution, educational deprivation, and cultural stigmatization. Black people have been bought, sold, killed, beaten, raped, excluded, exploited, shamed, and scorned for a very long time. That's why Black lives matter. That's why not all lives matter, because that is the experience of Black people. And for me, the first time in my life that I experienced this as an issue was because when I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old, I was walking down my street where I lived, and a child younger than me, much younger than me, spat at me. Spat at me. This is in the 1970s. And I knew in that moment that I couldn't do anything about it. I could have hit him, I could have pushed him, I could have said something to him. But what I didn't know at the time, and what racism means, is that behind that child was the state and all its institutions. It was the difference in power that he had, despite the fact that he was half my age, that was behind him. And that, I didn't realize that at the time. It was in my subconsciousness. And I retold this story many years later to those producers and directors of the Stephen Lawrence drama series. And that was the beginning of episode 2 of not the drama series, the documentary. And I asked the directors, well, why is that story important? And they said that that's exactly the point that we want to make, that what the Lawrence family were up against was the state and its institutions. And what Black Lives Matter is not that Black Lives is about prejudice or racism is about prejudice, it's about power and the inequalities between parts of the community. The second time that Black Lives Matter came to me was on the 22nd of April 1993. I was in West London working as a lawyer, and in South East London was a murder that was taking place of Stephen Lawrence, when a young man of 19 was targeted by up to 6 white youths, and he was stabbed repeatedly and murdered because of the color of his skin. And I wasn't to know then that my life, my professional life, indeed my personal life, would be inextricably linked to that particular case. And so for 25 years or so, I've been talking about racism and trying to deal with it. And may I give you what is a rather jaded view about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. Because I've had this conversation so many times that I am now sick to death of having it again. And I stopped talking about it now. I have written and spoken, and I did an estimate of the number of times I've spoken about race and racism and about these issues, almost 5,000 times. I have about 2,500 speeches that I have saved on my hard drive talking about this issue. And everything that we've talked about today, I've talked about 25 years ago. And so I'm a bit jaded and negative about the future. And may I explain why? When we had the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, we were asked essentially to put down on a plain piece of paper what we wanted. Because what we did before then is we knew what we didn't want. We didn't want racism. We knew who the bad people were. We knew the things that oppressed us and discriminated against us. And now for the first time, the Lawrence Inquiry Macpherson was saying, well, what is it that you want? And that was quite a responsibility on us. And we were terrified. We were terrified because if we put the wrong things down, it would affect many thousand millions of people across this country. But we did our best. And I remember after the report came out, precisely the sense of euphoria that we have now allowed people to into the home of the Lawrence family, and for them to recognize, acknowledge, accept that racism exists. And those of us who are quite young, and I see all of you here, despite my looks, I'm fairly old, but in my time when I was growing up, the idea that racism existed was not accepted by anybody. So we had this sense of euphoria, which I see again now. And I hear in your voices the optimism that we've now turned that corner, that everybody's recognized, acknowledged, and accepted that racism exists, and now we've got to do something about it. No. It is not the case that everybody now recognizes, acknowledges, accepts that racism exists. We know that because the thousands of I say this because it's the immediate thing that comes to my mind, the thousands of complaints to ITV about the diversity. There are people out there who simply do not recognize, acknowledge, and accept that it occurs. We've got to get beyond that. And if we just stick to within the Black Lives Matter, we fool ourselves to thinking that everybody else is thinking the way that we are. So I go back to 1999 and when the report came out, and the sense of euphoria that I felt that we're finally changed society. And 25 years later, we're talking about the same thing. So we failed. We failed abysmally in changing society. We did it to a certain extent, but we haven't done enough. So if you can't change it in 25 years, are we going to be able to change it in 6 months or 12 months? Not by a long shot. And let me tell you where I think the problems are. And forgive me, this might sound like a cantankerous old man, but I have become cantankerous because I meet racism on a daily basis, institutionally, not personally. Very few people will say anything to my face, and the racism that I suffered as a child, I don't see anymore. And that's because racism exists, but it doesn't stand still. It changes shape, size, purpose, and function. And it produces a reaction to that change, to the change that we want. So in the old days, you might have the British National Party and National Front on your street corner. We don't have that anymore. We have the more subtle type of racism, which is in what happened in the Home Office with the Windrush scandal. We have things which are under the surface, which are much more subtle in their approach. Because although as we become more anti-racist, the racists know how to deal with it and how to operate. Racism changes with economy, social structure, system, but above all the challenges to that system. So the challenge against and the reaction to the Lawrence inquiry was phenomenal. Police force up and down the country knew how to deal with it. So now we didn't have to say that they didn't have to do the things that they were doing before, they could change it. And so what we are seeing now with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing change, but no change. We're seeing what reminds me of what I was doing in my early days as a lawyer. As a solicitor, as a lawyer, I used to go into prisons, and outside those prisons there used to be a blue plaque, which said, we do not tolerate any form of racism once you go past this door. And then you went past that door and you saw the most blatant racism in the world. So we have the change or the perception of change, but actually no change at all. We have difference, but actually no difference. We have people who are wearing anti-racism armbands and kneeling at football matches, but without any structural change. So what we assume is happening, that change is happening because we believe it and we see it. And it came to its head, and I was quite shocked by this. At one meeting, it was said by the speaker who introduced me, look how much change we've made. We've got a black princess, Meghan Markle. And that is what I think produces the complacency and the idea that somehow we've got rid of it. Because post-Lawrence, everybody said we've got rid of the problem of racism. That's 25 years ago. Everyone said that the Home Affairs Select Committee is about to report 20 years post-McPherson, and I'm really interested to see what they say. And I gave evidence to that inquiry. And if you see the video, I don't ask you to see it because, again, you'll see the cantankerous, raging, angry man that I am. Because I'm angry because I've talked about this and talked about this and talked about this. I now try not to accept invitations to talk about because I'll end up being as angry and as jaded as I appear today. And I apologize for that. But I also want to put this out there, that just by these symbols that are taking place, and I've seen almost every multinational company, even South Bank University, putting up on its homepage that it stands with Black Lives Matters. Scratch below the surface. Has anything changed apart from this? Does the fact that we're having this discussion Is that enough for South Bank University to say that it's dealing with the issue of racism? Until there are structural changes, I will not be happy. And the way that you change society is not to see it as individual acts of prejudice, but to see it as structural, systemic problem. And the only organization in society which has the power to change is government, because the government sets the tenor and the tone of how society operates. It is the only powerful organization that can change it at a stroke. This government won't. Nearly every government that's come to power has refused to deal with the issue of racism and institutional racism. And it's not going to change over the next 6 months or 12 months, and certainly while this particular government is in power in the UK. And the US, I've been reading about, and most recently listening to podcasts about the American system. The black man who faced 6 trials because of one district attorney who was racist and challenged 58 out of 60 jurors because he could get away with it. And it took a campaign to eventually get him released when evidence was withheld from the defense. The system in America is much, much worse than the system here. But as far as the UK is concerned, I don't think that unless the Black Lives Matter goes from what it is and produces structural change, we will be talking about this issue next year, the year after, and the year after that. It is good that there are public statements, and I completely agree that they should happen, but those on their own is not what is going to produce it. Because I'm afraid to say, to use a catchphrase, been there, done it, and nothing's happened. I don't want to be here and see this and nothing happen. My fear is that is where we are. We are being given morsels. We're being told by institutions that we're doing something about it. And what we have to deal with is systemic and structural racism. I don't think, and I disagree, I'm afraid, with Justin, with due respect, as they say in the law here, that we're going to be able to achieve that. I think it's going to be another decade at least before we see those changes. They are small, they are incremental, they're right and they're proper. But the optimism that I've heard from all the previous speakers so far, I regret to say, Donovan, and I hate to say it, but I think it is far too optimistic from my view. And I think a bit of pessimism is necessary for us to say, actually, it's not simply about symbolism, it's not simply about phrases, as important they are, it is about action and structural change. That is the way that we're going to change in the future. My apologies if this sounds jaded, pessimistic, and cantankerous, but I'm afraid I'm at that age where I can get away with it, I hope. And I hope it is a discussion that we need to have. There are very few people, I think, that have gone through that process and seen it. And I completely recognize in myself that even now when I see it on the television or where I hear about it, of course I'm absolutely optimistic about the future, and I want to be optimistic. And then I see the next day that something else happens, and another person is killed, and another person is killed, and this discrimination continues. And, you know, I think, well, if we've accepted it's happening, why haven't we gone to the process of changing? So we'll have little bits of progress, but that's part of the plan, isn't it? The state gives you a little bit pretending. I'm allowed to become a QC. There's 1 or 2 judges on the judiciary. Oh, we've dealt with it without changing the structure. And the thing about Obama, I used to say this, I was so proud when he became president, but in his tenure, there were more people, black people in prison in the US. It passed the 50% mark. And so it's not just about having positions in people in power, unless those people in power change the structure that allows racism to exist. So it's not just about having people in positions of leadership. We had a black police officer, the first black police officer, head of Chief Constable of Thames, I think it's Thames Valley, or one of the police forces. Nothing changed in that police service while he was Chief Constable. So it is about structural racism. I think I better stop before I depress everybody else too much further. Thank you, Donovan.
Thank you, Imran. A very honest and candid, as always, view from you. jaded, negative. I still think you have vigor and passion, and we will obviously try to dispel your negative concerns over the coming months and years. I mean, the good thing about this panel is that it's wide, and there's a range of us talking on the same topic, but from different points of views. I've been getting some tweets through, and there's a number of people who are very happy to hear a young person speaking. So that's you, Grace, and talking about your optimism and what you can hopefully do within the law coming through. But you're right to some extent, Imran, that if we do become in a place of authority or status, some things never change. One has to hope that over time it will change. And you are right with regards to Obama and the statistics regarding black men in prison. Obviously, Justin will be able to have more of an insight and talk about President Obama and the legacy he has left in the USA. And now that the reins have been given to Donald Trump, and it's for the American people in 6 weeks or whenever to make their decision as to who should occupy the White House, and which will obviously have an impact on the Western world, to say the least. But thank you again, Imran, and everybody for the views of today. I do have a number of questions which I'm now going to filter through, which I have been doing over the time. So there it is. But I understand that before that, Mohammed wants to speak. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much again to the speakers. I feel like I spoke early enough that I was able to listen really intently. Imran, I fully hear your concerns. I will say, coming into this, I thought we was going to get the president of Pakistan, but I can't say I'm disappointed. I think just in relation to hope, right? And I speak as someone who grew up not caring about the system, not caring about change, because I was too busy trying to survive, right? And I feel like in the world, a lot of us felt alone, and alone in our own issues, alone in our own stresses and depression, etc. And I think, firstly, with the advent of social media and platforms like this, that's allowing us to connect all over the world, globally, at a touch of a button. At one point, I feel like we felt like we was cutting through, if that means like just getting away with just surviving. You know, we could keep quiet and, do our thing, and, consequences for our own particular actions would be the only thing that we'll get. And I feel like with all these deaths that we've been seeing in America, and then we've had a lot of deaths in custody as well here in England. And I used to sit on the deaths in custody panels. I used to sit on the independent custody visitors, stop and search monitor groups. All these panels that I didn't know existed when I didn't care. I feel like because of technology has really erased that gap and that distance, we're actually seeing each other's plight, and we're seeing that there's people that care, and we're actually seeing, as Justin was saying, you could be sitting in your car minding your business and still get shot. And for me, I was similar to you in terms of Obama. I used to give him a rough time, if I'm honest with you. I used to say, look, having a black man as president doesn't change anything, because nothing ain't changed for black people. He ain't done nothing for black people in particular, etc. But I feel like firstly, the fact that he became president is something that will always stay with me. First and foremost, as Justin said, his kids were actually surprised that white people could actually be president, and I think that's amazing. That's some justice. That's something I'm going to be taking away from tonight, if I'm honest with you. That their kind of reality it's amazing. But for me, I feel like people like Ilhan Omar, I can't tell the difference between Senate and Congress, if I'm totally honest with you. But her getting her platform and seeing all these things, it inspires me, and it inspires a lot of people, because it shows we can. But with Obama, again, he's a man that went to such a position almost alone. And there's always going to be limitations and things like that. But for me, it hasn't daunted me. I'm aiming to be mayor of London for 2024, and when that happens, I'll go back for it 2028. Same as when I decided to become a councillor, I didn't really put that much thought into it, but a lot of effort and focus went into it. And my thing is, it's about that those roads exist, as opposed to the time where we were quite small-minded in what we felt like we could do. For me, I've already connected with a lot of my brothers and sisters in America. I'm doing a lot of work with guys from Cure Violence in Chicago, and we're sharing experiences. And I think with this technology that has shortened the gap, it doesn't feel like just the 4% of the population we are in this country, we can't change anything. We've seen all the kind of devastation that's happening across the world when Black people are being shot. These things used to happen and there was no action and there was no care and there was no outrage. And I feel like it's a step. So I started off similar to you in terms of my mind frame. But for me, I feel like maybe I was a bit old. Who knows? Maybe I'm getting younger. Who knows? I feel like I'm becoming more and more optimistic as I have conversations like this. And I hear young people like Grace coming through, and she's 100 years ahead of me when I was her age. And I don't even know her age yet. I'm not even going to expose my age. But for me, that's where I feel we're not alone anymore. We're connecting more and more every day. And the establishment will be absolutely stupid to ignore us.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. That's very kind, and we're running out of time, so I want to go to some questions. But thank you ever so much for your input again. I want to put one question. I've got a number, but I'll be quick and short as I can. And I would like to put this question to Angela, please. And it's a question from a lady called Sally, which says, "Is the BAME label a help or a hindrance? Where does it come from?"
I think it's a key issue, and I think that lots of groups are discussing this. Mohammed touched on it earlier. One of my concerns is that it does lump us together. We have to move forward in a unified way, but we also have to recognise that there are differences between us. So just looking at some stats this afternoon, I mentioned a bit earlier on the Solicitors Regulation Authority website, the percentage, for example, of Asian individuals reaching partnership level is very different, for example, to the percentage of African Caribbeans. So we experience different racism in different ways, and I think it is very easy for us to be lumped together, and then for very specific action that's required for specific groups of us within the umbrella terminology, it's easy for that to be swept under the table. And I've been at meetings where I've specifically asked, yes, you're giving me a figure for BAME, can I have the broken down stats for how this impacts on African Caribbean individuals, for example? So Pamela really spoke about the impact and the lack of presence of African Caribbean men within the legal profession. And until we've got stats really breaking down and being specific, BAME is a hindrance. And I think there's lots of debates happening currently about renaming our organisations.
Thank you. Another question, which I'm going to put this one to Grace, if I may. And the question says, what can white people do as allies?
Well, I've had quite a few friends and friends with differing acts in terms of how they've gone about the situation, and it's been very telling how different people have reacted to the situation. So I'm gonna go off what one of my friends have done and what I thought was really impactful. So first of all, educating yourself on the issues faced by the Black community, understanding what a microaggression is and how to not go about putting microaggressions on people, because it does have a long-lasting impact, and it does really evoke self-hate in some of the Black community. I know that's been the conversations that I've been having with some people, especially younger relatives. I've been having these really difficult conversations with them. It really does. A really small comment can really impact someone for the rest of their lives, and they really can carry that with them. also understanding white fragility, which is a comment Angela made. It's not about you. This is really impacting people, and you need to understand that it's not about you, and not gaslighting Black people on these issues. So I think definitely educating yourself, understanding unconscious bias. That's something that's really important. And as I mentioned before, having unconscious bias in terms of institutional racism as well, having people in all these institutions educated on what unconscious bias is and how to not,
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to put a question to Justin, if I may. You mentioned earlier that we are so far apart, but we are close in incidents which are occurring, and I appreciate the incidents in America in comparison to the United Kingdom being far more greater and grave. What's your perception of Black Lives Matter in the United Kingdom? And do you see any parallels, strong parallels with the USA, or do you think that the two things are completely different?
No, listening to all of you and all of your stories, I can tell that it's the same. The difference is just you guys haven't had the George Floyd death yet over there. You haven't had a Rayshard Brooks death. You haven't had these, a Breonna Taylor happen yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it just hasn't happened yet. Those things are symptoms of a bigger problem. The underlying problem is the same. I mean, it's exactly the same problem. It's just a different history that gets you to that problem. So what that tells me is that the world has a racism problem. A world has a problem with Black people. A world has a problem with people that look like us and come from, a shared history in Africa. And so that is an issue. We can't, if we solve the problem in America, we will solve the problem in the UK, and we'll solve the problem everywhere else. And if you solve the problem there, the problem will be solved everywhere. And like Imran said, it is not something that's easy or something that's going to be done in 6 months, but it can be chopped away at it. I like to think of it like chopping down a forest. And you have to just get one tree and then another tree and another tree. And it might take you 100 years to chop the forest down. But if you don't start chopping, the forest will stay up forever. And I think that that's where we are. We are somewhere into chopping the forest, and we have to keep chopping. And eventually, if we keep and continue like we're doing right now, the forest will come down. But we are at the beginning and not the middle or the end of that process. So the difference to me is just you guys haven't had that world-changing incident yet, the one that everybody looks at and says, this is ridiculous, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of an officer kneeling on somebody's neck, that kind of thing. But that can change today, tomorrow, whenever, unfortunately, because we all have that same underlying problem.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Justin. I mean, there are so many quotes I could say. I mean, Nelson Mandela said, the struggle is my life. And maybe this will take a long time for changes to happen. You're from Atlanta, Georgia. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated 52 years ago. And there was a famous speech within hours of his death by Robert Kennedy. And he talked about the death in his own family of JFK years before that. People may say there has been movement, there hasn't been movement. I think what we need to do is continue to be as positive as we can, keep talking, listening to each other, and continue to get into places of position, which hopefully can then make a resounding effect on change. But I think, again, I would like to say, I think tonight has been a wonderful occasion, coming together and giving our own experience collectively and also individually. I'd like to thank the audience for listening and the questions that were filtered through to me. And finally, just to hand back over to Robert Hush, the President of the South London Law Society, that he could just wrap this up. Wherever you are, Robert. Thank you. Thank you.